So welcome to the Political Science Speaker Series Seminar. I'm Randall Germain. I'm in the Department of Political Science. And today we have Paul Bowles, who teaches at the University of Northern British Columbia, which is close to my heart. I'm from the Yukon, and I used to travel through Prince George all the time. And he's here to talk about the dynamics of pipeline resistance in British Columbia. Just a quick bio or two of Paul. He's one of these kind of slightly crazy academics, who began life as an economist, more or less.
I was disciplined in economics.
But as you can now see, he's economics and international studies, and he also publishes in political economy. And he has got kind of a Hyde and Jekyll persona. Part of his research is on, I would call local politics, like pipeline resistance in BC, and also, just to balance that out, he's done a lot of work publishing on the internationalization of the Chinese currency, among other topics connected to international currencies. So he's also very active in the political economy tradition, which is why we like that. That's good tradition to be active in. He is very well published. He's got several books. I won't even begin to go over the edited volume. It's just the stuff that he has written. He's got Capitalism, a little book. How does it put it? What's the series? Big Ideas in Small Books or something like that?
Yeah.
Short History of a Big Idea. Yeah. Capitalism, yeah. Can you imagine that? He's published a very good book called National Currencies and Globalization in the Right series that I edited way back in the day. And you've also got The Political Economy of China's Financial Reforms. So we're very much looking forward to getting a talk about politics in BC and pipelines and energy. He'll speak for 30-ish minutes, and then we grill him, mercilessly, like we always do. Paul,
okay.
There you go.
Thank you. I better get my 30 minutes in before the grilling starts then. Okay, so thanks very much for coming today. So let me tell you a bit about what I'm going to tell you today. I don't know how familiar you all are with the context of what's going on in northern BC right now. So I'll give you a little bit of the contextual background, and this is this research that I'm presenting today is part of a larger project, and I'll talk a little bit about that. I'll talk about pipelines and what's happening in BC, and I'm going to talk particularly about Northern Gateway. We all know it as Enbridge. It's known in BC as the Enbridge pipeline, even though it's called Northern Gateway because Northern Gateway is a separate company. So that if it gets sued, it's not Enbridge being sued, it's the separate company. So the sort of legal challenges go to this organisation. So I'm going to talk about the resistance to the Enbridge pipeline, and I'm going to make the argument that it's actually a quite unique case of a project which has multiple entry points for resistance. And as one which has galvanized groups which often don't get along all that well together, but the threat of the pipeline is such that it's led to a real bringing together of these diverse groups into a coalition which I think will have some important implications down the road for what I'm calling I haven't got there yet. In the conclusions, I'm going to talk about social license in neoliberal times. So I think it has some very important implications for that. So I'll talk about the resistance to Enbridge, and then I'll talk about whether that coalition, which has come around opposition to Enbridge, is likely to continue in the case of LNG, or whether it's different, and if so, why it's different. Okay, so firstly, the context. So the context is around shifts in the global economy, and in particular, the rise of China. So if we just look at what's been happening in China relative to Japan, US, and the Eurozone, so real GDP indexed to 100 in 2005, you can see if you were going to hitch your wagon to one of these economies, it would be China. So that's a lot of what's driving some of these forces is the lure of exporting to Asia and to China in particular. So China's growth rate is much higher than everybody else's, and so there's this big shift to Asia. If we look at it again in terms of China's consumption of the world production of commodities, so China is now, so the pink line is 2002, the black line is 2012. You can see, for example, China now consumes 50% of the world's coal production, up from 30%. 68% of the world's iron ore production, zinc production, copper, and crude oil down here, doubling its share of world consumption of these commodities. So there has been a global commodities boom, of which China has been at the forefront, as you can see from these numbers. So the global commodities boom has affected many parts of the world, including in Latin America, where not only minerals but soybeans, all sorts of fuels, agricultural commodities have been in big demand from Asia too. So as part of this new extractivism, which we can see has happened in the 2010s, now there's that global commodities boom is arguably coming to an end now. So if you look at the copper futures price of copper, it's way down. Coal mines are starting to close in northern BC, which were opened under the boom. So that commodities boom, as China's economy slows down, may be slowing down too. But anyway, we can see the importance of the Chinese market. Let me go back. So within this context, Canada has sought to position itself as the energy superpower, as redefining itself as an economy based on energy resources exported to the world. But if it is to be a global energy superpower, it needs to, it's argued, break its over-reliance on the US market. Now, a lot of the attraction for both oil and LNG is price differences in the world economy. So arbitrage is key here. So there is a global market in oil, but because Canada has or the tar sands, oil sands, oils of a certain type, heavy oil, it all goes to US refineries at the moment. And because of the large supply, it's discounted in price there. So if it could find other markets, it would get a higher price. So there is an arbitrage in the oil price. There's an even bigger one in the LNG market, where liquefied natural gas is now traded not so much in a global market, but in continental markets. It's predominantly land-based pipelines on major continents. So that the price of natural gas per unit in North America is around $3 to $4. In Asia, it's about 14 to 15. So there's so because of this price difference, that's the rationale, that's the motivation for finding ways to export liquefied natural gas to Asia. So this would mean the condensing the natural gas in Canada, putting it on tankers, shipping it to Asia, where it's regasified for use, for energy use. So both these types of pipelines are premised on the need for exporting to diversify from the US market and take advantage of these price differences. So what's happening to this region, northern BC, is that it is globalizing as a result of that, and that's a larger project that a group of us have looking at that. So this is part of Canada's Asia Pacific Gateway strategy. For those of you who've heard about such a thing? How many people knew we had one? Everybody. Oh, God. So, and in this, Prince Rupert plays a key role here. So a port, deep water port, was constructed in Prince Rupert as it's the shortest sailing route to China. And of course, distance means time, time means money. So if you can ship into Prince Rupert, then that's more efficient, higher profits. So the first COSCO, China Ocean Shipping Company container ship, came into Prince Rupert in 2008. And since then there's been a steady flow, 2 or 3 sailings a week. So it's a natural deep water port. Prince Rupert is a relatively small town of about 16,000 people. It was about that size 100 years ago when Charles Hayes was someone who also thought Prince Rupert will be the new port of the future. It's the closest link to Asia, and he had big plans for it, but he went down with the Titanic, and so did the plans for Prince Rupert. But now, about 100 years later, it's back in this reincarnation. So this is part of a context in which West Coast port capacity is seen as being limited and as being difficult to expand. So there are opportunities for a new port, it's argued, which Prince Rupert will be the main one, as well. Vancouver is being increased in size too, because it's part of Canada's strategy to roughly double the share of Canada's West Coast container traffic, or Canada's share of North American West Coast container traffic over the next decade or so. So they want to double it from an 8% share to roughly a 17% share. And the purpose of getting all these goods from Shanghai into Prince Rupert is to then send them out to rail lines on containers into the US Midwest, Chicago, Memphis, New Orleans. So a major part of this talk is actually about corridors. And we're going to make corridors in various different senses. And this is the transportation corridor linking Asia with North American markets. So up in northern BC, there's a lot of work on infrastructure, a lot of work on roads, a lot of work on rail. That's to reposition the region as this transportation node between Asia and North America. So this is the way Asia and North America look now. They all come through Prince Rupert. This is the key point. In fact, someone was recently in Korea at a Korean energy convention. They had a similar map of Asia and North America, and they only had one place on North America marked, and that was not Prince Rupert, it was Kitimat, just down the road. And we'll see why in a minute. So part of what's going on in northern PC, and part of the larger context within which pipelines are occurring, is this repositioning of that part of the province in terms of these new global flows. Okay. So there's all these containers coming in, and they go back. And many of them, about 30%, go back empty. And so there's a push to get minerals and to fill those containers going back. And so a lot of lumber is now being shipped to China in containers. But as well as lumber, the other big export is going to be oil. So this is the proposed Enbridge pipeline going through a number of small communities all the way along out to the Kitimat terminal. Now, another way of looking at that map is like this. So that's the same route, but now going through various First Nations territories. and this we will come to. So last summer, a colleague, Henry Veltmeyer, and I travelled this route and interviewed as many of the opponents as we could, and that's partly what I'm basing this talk on. And when we did that, typical academics, we were asking them all these questions and one thing and another, and they said, well, you're just going to take what we've said and put it into some jargon that nobody will understand and that nobody will read. How does this help us in our fight against Enbridge? So what we did is we said, well, how about we put together an edited collection of the transcripts of your interviews? And so we did that, and this is the volume which comes out. So if you want to read some Voices of Pipeline Resistance, as the subtitle says, then this is the book to purchase. So the answer is still no, comes from the last rally that was held at the joint review process in 2013. So we're going to meet some of these authors, these interviewees, as we go through. So there's also an academic paper published in Extractive Industries and Society in the last issue on this, and it'll also be a chapter in this book on globalizing northern BC. So just what else is happening in terms of Enbridge is not the only game in town, of course. So this is the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline. There's also lots of discussion about the expansion of the Kinder Morgan pipeline, which will go down into Burnaby and Vancouver. So that's got a lot of opposition. I'd be happy to answer questions on that, but I haven't done any research on that, and the dynamics are a bit different in that case. There's a possibility that there may be a northern leg of Kinder Morgan which tries to come up through here, and of course there's the whole Keystone thing. Who knows where that's going to end up, and then who knows, maybe there'll be Energy East will be the way, but they'll have to get out. Alberta has good fortune in having oil, but bad fortune in being landlocked. So that's the problem that they're faced. Okay, so the proposal, for those of you who haven't met this, is for this 1,200 kilometre pipeline from the tar sands to Kitimat, pumping 525,000 barrels of bitumen per day to Kitimat, and there that would go on 225 super tankers, very large double-hulled tankers, to go to transport the oil to Asia and to the US. Now, I say Asia and the US, most people think of this as an Asian market that it's going to. In fact, if you look at the proposal and how it's changed over time, it really is a moving target. So initially, a lot of the talk was around selling oil to the US. Then it became moving, much more emphasis on moving to Asia. And we'll see some of the cost projections, the job projections, they change all the time too. And so it's quite if you're doing research on this, be careful what date you're looking at, because the numbers change depending on when it is. So one big pipeline to take bitumen one way, and then a smaller pipeline parallel to take this condensate, which thins the oil for transportation in the pipeline the other way. And it would go out of Kitimat through the Douglas Channel, or the Hecate Strait. And that'll be important in a minute. So the cost of this was originally supposed to be about $5.5 billion. Now the estimate is about $6.5 billion. 3-year construction period. And the number of jobs created is another moving target. And the amount of tax revenue is another moving target. So it's difficult to get a handle on this, because sometimes they'll quote direct jobs. Sometimes it includes construction jobs, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it includes indirect estimates, and then you have to make assumptions about, okay, what will be the multiplier? Are those people already employed, or are they new jobs? So there are all sorts of numbers that you'll see around. So you'll see anywhere from between 104 permanent jobs in BC to 560 indirect permanent jobs, depending on what assumptions are made. Tax revenues of about $2.6 billion over 30 years, which is really not very much. But the big money comes in royalties, and that's estimated to be about 80 billion. And in terms of the politics of BC, which we'll meet in a minute, BC doesn't get any of that. It gets taxes, it doesn't get royalties. And then the other figure you'll see is 300 billion. The project is worth 300 billion because they'll take the royalties, they'll take the taxes, and then they say, okay, let's apply a multiplier to this of how many spin-offs there are, how many people will pay taxes on the money which they receive from this. So indirectly. So you'll see anywhere from 2.6 in taxes to 300 billion in indirect total impact on the economy. So you have to look carefully through that. In terms of the process, Enbridge was first interested in about 2005 and filed for federal review in 2010. A joint review process was set up under the National Energy Board Act and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. Then they had public hearings from January 2012 to June 2013. And this, the answer was still no, comes from the last rally that was held in Terrace in 2013. Now already, everywhere the joint review process went, it was, okay, this is where we're having the protests today. This is where we're having the protests next week. It followed the joint review process around, and there were big protests every time, everywhere they went. So that's been quite interesting, because now they don't want that for the Kinder Morgan review. So there are quite strenuous tests now for who has intervener status with Kinder Morgan to try and cut that down, the public opposition. So as I'm sure you all know, the Joint Review Panel recommended in December last year approval of the project with subject to 209 conditions, and this was then accepted by way of some press release late one Friday afternoon in June 2014 by the Cabinet. Now, the provincial government chose at an early stage not to exercise its own right for provincial environmental assessment reviews, and said we will accept whatever happens at the federal level. However, as time went on, the pressure mounted on the government not to take this hands-off approach, and so they came up with their own 5 conditions for acceptance, and they used the term very explicitly, social license. They say, and I'll talk about this later, say for the Enbridge project to have social license in BC, it must meet the following 5 conditions. So the first one was that the project be approved by the National Energy Board. The second one was that there be in place world-class marine spill responses. So you've seen some action around that by the federal government. World-class land spill responses. Adequate consultation with Aboriginal groups, which is a condition which arguably Enbridge will never meet. So the province has backed itself into a corner there. But the fifth one, the one that's got the most attention, is a fair share for BC, by which so there have been these discussions between Christy Clark, Premier of BC, and then Premier of Alberta, Angela Redford, around, okay, how can BC get its share of these royalty payments, and what should be the sort of predominant discourse coming out of the Liberals in BC has been, BC has all the risks, Alberta has all the financial gains. We need fair compensation for those risks. So now I'll talk about that a bit later. So the BC provincial government has this position of so far saying the conditions for Enbridge have not been met. So they are opposed. They have or remain opposed. We're not quite sure when push comes to shove what will happen with them. But if we look at the opposition more generally, I will argue that it's not going away, and that the Enbridge project is very unlikely to succeed. So this is a rally against the pipeline in Smithers, a small community of about 5,000 or 6,000 people on the proposed pipeline route. I've put this one up for a couple of reasons. One is because you see First Nations. These are from the Wet'suwet'en peoples. Traditional territory includes Smithers. This is John Ridsdale, who is one of the contributors or interviewees in the book. So symbolically and also in reality, this movement is Indigenous-led. Okay, so not only are they literally in the front of the parade, but also in terms of the strength of the opposition and the ability to mobilize resources against the pipeline. It's also true that they are the leaders and very much acknowledged as such, and know their role as such. I also wanted to show you this poster. The answer is still no with the fist. So this. So we borrowed their title from Terrace. The answer is still no. And then when they saw the book, they said, "Hey, we like that. Can we borrow? Will the publisher let us have the rights to that oil-soaked fist?" We said, "Sure." And it's so that's a Wet'suwet'en produced poster, and the no here has various Aboriginal carvings of salmon and whatever. And you also get to see a picture of beautiful British Columbia. So, okay. So if we think in terms of the sort of classic literature in terms of the resistance to extractivism, then you can identify three main positions, three main explanations. One looks at sort of a class-based analysis of extractivism, where labour is the key opponents in opposition. Another one would be historical analyses of imperialism and colonialism, with indigenous groups at the forefront. So where the arguments are around colonization of land, the fight for land rights, the impacts of land degradation on indigenous health, indigenous spirituality, indigenous culture. So something that you find predominantly across Latin America too. And then a third form of analysis would be to look at social movements and the role of civil society and NGOs, often seen as more sort of middle class activism based on post-industrial quality of life issues, and qualitatively different from the activism of the industrial period. And so sometimes people will argue that social movements have replaced class as the main way of understanding resistance to extractive industries and sort of over time. But you can also see them as also happening at the same point in time, and so then you get lots of talk about red-green alliances or blue-collar green alliances, about how can labour and indigenous and environmental groups work together. Well, on this one issue, as it happens, you can find all three of those elements in the Enbridge case, and they all, despite differences on other issues, have come together on this one. So I'm going to argue that indigenous groups are the dominant groups in this particular coalition. We can find elements of key social of social movement theory and civil society and NGOs, but that's quite complex, particularly the relationship between local and international and national-based NGOs. And labour is also involved, although basically has no ability to organise. If labour unions organise a rally, 10 people show up. If First Nations do, it's a full house. Okay, so what we see in the case of the Northern Gateway is a broad-based coalition based upon multiple entry points. So you do see labour involved, so you see the BC Federation of Labour, you even see the Alberta Federation of Labour, whose objections, so the classic resistance to extractivism from labour is usually based around wages. This is not a wage struggle, this is a job struggle, an employment struggle. So it's around the export of jobs. You'll also see other unions involved, like the BC Federation of Teachers, which is not directly involved in employment issues, but is doing so taking a position in solidarity with First Nations. So you do see large elements of the labour movement involved either directly as an employment issue or through solidarity with other groups. That feeds into a sort of wider group of economic nationalists who look at the value added from Canada's resources being so low and arguing that raw materials should not be exported in that form, particularly to China. So the Asia Pacific of Canada Foundation, the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada does surveys every year on by province who feels warm towards certain countries, who feels cool towards certain countries. Well, the largest feeling of coolness towards China is in BC. It's also the largest feeling of warmness in BC. Now, lots of people don't know, don't care, but there is a significant group of people who, for whatever reason, don't feel that, so taking an economic nationalist position, tend to take a zero-sum view of trade and zero-sum view of economic interdependence, and so would argue that that BC should not be giving away its resources to help China. So there's quite a substantial sort of portion of the population who would follow that. Obviously, environmentalists. So the proposed pipeline would not only traverse 2 mountain ranges, it would also cross 800 streams and rivers, many of which are salmon bearing. So that has mobilized opposition based on particular individual watersheds. So the threat of spills, and so not only the disruption during construction, but also the threat of spills during operation. And not only watersheds, but also the ocean itself. So as you may know, there's a moratorium on tanker traffic off the BC coast, and this would have to be lifted in order for these super tankers to take oil out. This is the Exxon Valdez experience is still in the memory of many on the west coast, and a ferry, the Queen of the North, recently sank in that area too. So for all these reasons, there's huge concern over the risks associated with spills and collisions, both in watersheds and on the ocean, which has brought together people in the environmental movement. At the same time, there's also linked not only to specific watersheds, but also to climate change, has brought another layer of environmental activism too, where the export of oil to China would permit the expansion of the tar sands in Alberta, and so rather than being an energy superpower, Canada would enhance its reputation as a climate fossil and so there's lots of so the environmental movement is coalesced around that too. The fishing industry, both the sports and commercial aspects, these two groups do not get on at all. They are typically at loggerheads with each other. They're often in court against each other. They don't speak to each other. They have diametrically opposed interests, except in the case of Enbridge, where the threat is to both of them. So in the face of the larger external threat, they have come together as a group under the auspices of NGOs such as Friends of Wild Salmon, which brings together both commercial and sports fishers. Local governments too, so 31 municipal governments, 2 regional districts, the Union of BC Municipalities have all voted against having the pipeline. And the most interesting municipality in this case was Kitimat itself, which voted in April this year in a non-binding plebiscite, 58% to 42% against approval of Northern Gateway. And that's important because Kitimat is I don't know how many of you know the history of Kitimat, built in the 1960s as a town around Alcan smelter, importing bauxite from Jamaica to use BC's cheap energy to produce aluminum for export. So it's very much, it's one of the, historically been a very pro-development, pro any industrial development community. And so to have that vote there, particularly where the First Nations residents of old Kitimat, after they were moved when Alcan came in, were outside of the voting area. So those votes were not included. They were not eligible to vote in this referendum. So it was only the settler community which voted, and they still voted against. Now, some of that is because, why might this be the case? And why might these communities in general be voting against them? Well, in some cases it's based on tourism, the risk of what's happening to other industries. So tourism, especially fishing industries. Many communities feel burned by having work camps, construction work camps, which are typically built just outside of municipal boundaries. They still have to service those, but they don't get any tax revenue. Plus there are all these social consequences that often come with work camps. So there's a sort of a jaded, amongst municipal politicians, a jaded view of work camps. But there's also an important part of sort of second, third generation settlers who are now living in particularly the northwest, who have this same attachment to place now, which wasn't the case 20, 30, 40 years ago. And I just want to read one quote from somebody from the book who he's a mail carrier. He has no previous experience as an activist, but became a leading member of Douglas Channel Watch, which is the local NGO opposing Enbridge. And it's just read what he says. He says, "The Enbridge proposal has really brought a lot of people together in a way that hasn't happened before, especially with the oral statements before the joint review panel. When people were speaking in Kitimat village here, the Aboriginal people got to hear about how much this place means to us, the newcomers. I think that was the first time they'd ever really heard emotion like that from us about how we love this place." And so that was so those JRP hearings brought people together in this way and sort of made them feel a connection with place, which previously had not been vocalized. Another reason for the resistance is simply that it's being built by Enbridge, a company which does not have a very good track record. The Kalamazoo spill in 2010 didn't do them any favours at all, and led to a lot of publicity in the area. And Enbridge has made a lot of mistakes in this campaign, lots of mistakes. From basically saying it's just like Alberta, just go and pay whatever you have and pay whatever is needed and just get the job done. They made a big mistake with these super tankers are to go out the Douglas Channel, and they produced a video showing how this would happen, but they photoshopped the Douglas Channel to remove all the bends and the islands so that it looked like a nice clear passage. And of course this was picked up, and this became another huge public relations disaster for them. So they did not play it well either. So process issues I can come back to and talk about later. But I just want to talk about corridors a minute, because we've heard about transportation corridors. The pipelines are often referred to as energy corridors, but corridors for First Nations communities mean something quite different. And so this is a map which is south of Fort St. James, for those who know the area. So this is in the Clancy traditional territory, but this is not their reserve. And this is the Stewart River. And this shows land use patterns now. So the dark pink is agricultural land. The light pink is Crown tenure. And the yellow is private land. And so this used to be the traditional territory which was used for hunting, fishing, gathering. The river was a main trade route. Has also great cultural significance, and with land use patterns which this was the Carrier-Sakani Tribal Council's traditional use coordinator put this together and has given me permission to use this. So large parts of traditional territory are now corridors which cannot be used for the traditional purposes. And the big fear with the pipelines is that they will create new corridors. And so your talk of cumulative impacts is critical here, because it's not just a pipeline going through land which has nothing else on it. It's yet another incursion, along with all those transportation corridors which are being expanded, on traditional territories, which means that the ability to continue to operate in a non-commodified way, that is the ability to hunt and fish outside of the capitalist market economy, and to maintain traditional ways of life in both the production and distribution of that output, is being threatened. So the fact that it involves corridors is extremely important for the land-based First Nations communities. And so the Nakladsi First Nation is one of 6 which has formed the Yinka Dene Alliance, and I took this photo about 3 weeks ago when I drove up to Smithers, and this is just, here's the highway here, and I saw the sign, I stopped and thought I took a sign of it. So all along the highway, you'll see signs: no trespassing, Enbridge. You do not have permission to be on this land. If you are, you will be prosecuted accordingly. So very high levels of resistance against the notion of more corridors and the cumulative impact of those corridors. Right. Okay. Well, I'm going to talk about maybe you'll ask me about LNG, so I'll quickly show you what's happening with LNG. So here are the gas fields. The idea is to come out to Prince Rupert or to Kitimat. These are all the proposed LNG corridors, pipelines, now going on here. So, can I continue talking in there?
Yeah,
okay. But you'll get a visual image of the corridors that we're talking about here. Okay. So, okay. Maybe I should stop there. Now you have the visuals.
Yeah, and then we can conclude in there.
And we'll just conclude. I'll just wrap in there. Is that okay?
That's great.
Okay.
Okay, so